BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, could solar farms be better for nature than arable farms?
When the solar farms had hedgerows and a diverse mix of flora with a high sward height, that provided habitat and room for foraging for the birds. So we saw an increased number of individuals and an increased number of species over grazed solar farms and intensive arable agricultural land.
More on that study from the RSPB later. First, regenerative agriculture, or regen ag, something we talk about a lot on this programme. But, as you may have noticed, it's a term creeping into food businesses' marketing jargon. So what exactly do they mean by it? Well, Dan Saladino has been looking into that for today's food programme.
Everyone seems to be using the word, from the smallest of small-scale farmers to the biggest food corporations in the world, from NGOs to government departments of agriculture. But there's no strict definition, and regenerative or regen has become such a broad umbrella term, I feel increasingly confused as to what it really means. And the word also troubles Ken Giller, Professor of Plant Production Systems at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. A few years ago, he came across the term at a sustainability meeting held by Unilever.
I was the only agriculturist in the room, and everybody was talking about regenerative agriculture. I was, what on earth is going on here?
And so he began his research into the rise and rise of the term.
We did a very rapid quick scan, and it was everywhere in the news, in social media, nowhere in the science literature, because it had taken off in a different space.
That space had its origins in the United States in the 1980s, and ideas being developed by Robert Rodale, a leader in the organic movement.
I'm not satisfied with the term sustainability. I think it's very appealing to policymakers and scientists because they think it's simple and they can understand it. But I don't think the average person aspires to live in a sustained environment. They want to live in something that's going better. So I think the idea of regeneration is more appealing.
It wasn't until the 1990s that the term really started to take off, led by farmers in the Midwest desperately looking for ways to regenerate landscapes and focusing on reducing disturbance of soil with no tillage and zero tillage practices. And then, in the last decade, the term really went mainstream.
We found actually that the explosion of the use in the news media really took off in 2015, 2016.
Which is when some of the world's biggest food businesses start to embrace the term. Ken published a paper in 2021 raising concerns over a lack of an agreed definition. And that's when some of those big companies started to contact him.
One of the first responses I had was from a big company, and I won't mention which one because it's an embarrassing comment. And they said, we just committed $3 billion to this regenerative agriculture program. Can you help us define what it means?
There are, of course, common features of regenerative agriculture in practice, such as not disturbing soil, use of cover crops, and use of livestock. But there's still plenty of scope for confusion and contradiction, argues Ken Giller.
There's a huge emphasis on no tillage, minimum tillage or zero tillage. And yet at the same time, we're supposed to reduce agrochemical inputs. Now, if you don't till, what do you do about the weeds? So a lot of zero-till agriculture is heavy dependence on the use of glyphosate, on use of herbicides. If we do away with herbicides, how do we control the weeds if we don't till? There's a real contradiction there.
Many argue regen doesn't need a definition or an agreed set of standards or practices, saying it's more of a process and it focuses on outcomes rather than protocols. But asking the question, what does regenerative agriculture really mean, is important, says Professor Giller.
I think it's a really important question because of how pervasive the term regenerative agriculture has become. I think that we are often not aware of how important language is when it comes to these things because we tend to use terms very glibly, and they're often terms which give us a very warm feeling, but we don't necessarily understand the full implications of what they are.
Ken Giller there from Wageningen University. More from him and Dan in the food programme at 11 o'clock this morning here on BBC Radio 4 and also on BBC Sounds. Now, the topic we've been talking about all week, land use. There are many competing pressures on land, from using it to grow food or for housing and infrastructure or for nature. And in England, the government is consulting on a land use framework. Well, in Scotland, the first land use strategy was published in 2011. The Scottish government is required by law to publish one every 5 years. The first brought in a framework and principles to guide decisions on how land is used. The second introduced policies for specific sectors like forestry, agriculture and land reform. And the third, which covers from 2021 to 26, has what it describes as a more holistic approach to tackle climate change and the loss of nature. What then has the impact been? Sarah Cowie is Senior Policy Manager for Climate, Land and Business at the National Farmers Union Scotland.
I think if you were to ask our members what the impact has been on the ground, they'd probably say very little. It's probably something that not many farmers, crofters, land managers have heard of. It's not something that impacts their day-to-day life. I think from a policy perspective, there's still a bit of a feeling that, policy is kind of being done in silos, that different government departments don't really speak to each other, and actually some of the policies can be quite contradictory. So I think it does provide an overarching vision, I suppose, but not necessarily that join up in that pathway of getting things to all kind of talk to each other and make sense, I suppose.
Because that really was the idea. I mean, to quote from the current one, it says it's all about sustainable land use, and it highlights things like more forestry and peatland restoration, while trying to balance that with food production from farmers and crofters. But in practice, a farmer and a crofter wouldn't really notice any of that then.
I think we kind of see a land use strategy as being that kind of umbrella to all the other strategies that sit underneath it. So for the Scottish land use strategy, that's things like the Agriculture Rural Communities Act, we've got Land Reform Bill, we've got Biodiversity Strategy, Climate Change Plans. So I suppose those things perhaps make more of a tangible difference to farmers and crofters on the ground. I think the land use strategy itself, it does provide that kind of vision, and I suppose it's kind of what the English version is doing as well. It's essentially trying to say we want our land use to be more multifunctional, we want it to be more integrated, but I think it doesn't answer the really difficult questions. There are competing interests. We do have a finite amount of land. How actually are those trade-offs and those kind of difficult conversations going to be kind of addressed? But I think that's really what's missing from making the land use strategy kind of make a difference to people on the ground.
As you say, there are a lot of competing pressures on what we want land to do. In England, there is quite a lot of hope from all sorts of different directions that having a land use strategy will make those hard decisions a little bit more straightforward. Has that been the experience in Scotland?
I don't feel like the land use strategy has really answered those difficult questions of how those trade-offs are going to be addressed, and I think it's probably complicated just by different layers of government obviously making different kinds of decisions. I think that's something that we'd like to see more of, where we could actually use the land use strategy to try and understand how these trade-offs can be made. And obviously for us, for NFU Scotland representing agriculture, we really want to see farming and food production remaining profitable, remaining sustainable, remaining viable. But obviously there's other interests that other sectors have, and there's other goals that government wants to achieve. So I don't think that there's been proper consideration of how those trade-offs are going to be met, and we hope that that's going to be something that's part of the next land use framework.
If you were designing the next land use framework for Scotland, or indeed the one for England, what would you do to make it work?
I think it really needs to provide that pathway. As I said, the current land use strategy, it does provide that vision. We're wanting to see more multifunctional land use. We want to see integration. We need to achieve goals. And for the Scottish Government's vision for agriculture, that's around food production, climate mitigation, biodiversity and people. We have that vision and that's great, but we really need to see the pathway. And I think one of the things that is really hindering us in Scotland and probably beyond as well is that the policy is very slow to follow the strategy. We are seeing more movement now in terms of agricultural reform, but I think if we were going into the design of a new land use strategy, we really need to see not just the overarching vision, but the detail of how that's going to be enacted and what it's going to mean for farmers and crofters on the ground.
Sarah Cowie from NFU Scotland. Well, as we discussed there are hopes that a land use framework can help make difficult decisions, for instance, on solar farms. We highlighted a row in South Norfolk yesterday, where the company behind the plan points out the advantages of renewable power and what they'll do to help wildlife. But locals object to farmland being covered in panels.
There will be continuous sections of land covered by solar panels and associated infrastructure for many miles. 22 kilometres of footpaths will have solar panels along one side or both sides, and many more kilometres will have views of solar panels.
Well, land can, of course, be used for more than one thing at once, and a study from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds and researchers at the University of Cambridge says that solar farms managed for nature could benefit birds and other wildlife and be better for them than arable farms. Joshua Copping, a conservation scientist at the RSPB.
So our recent research showed that when solar farms are managed with nature in mind, it can provide important habitat for birds. And this came down to the way the solar farms were managed. Those grazed by sheep throughout the year or with heavy herbicide used didn't provide much habitat for the birds compared to arable land. But when the solar farms had hedgerows and a diverse mix of flora with a high sward height, that provided habitat and room for foraging for the birds. So we saw an increased number of individuals and an increased number of species over grazed solar farms and intensive arable agricultural land.
Presumably this depends very much on the arable farm that you're comparing it with, though, doesn't it? The RSPB has its own farm, Hope Farm, largely arable, produces food and a thriving place for birds.
Yeah, and that's a good point you've picked up on. It very much depends on what you compare it to. So we compared it to farms within the fens, so not many hedgerows present and really intensively managed without much kind of nature-friendly farming. And because of that, we saw an increased number of threatened species such as yellowhammer, linnet and corn bunting. Those are the species we'd already expect to see on the RSPB's Hope Farm.
We heard yesterday on the programme from people both pro and anti a big solar farm proposed in Norfolk. As they described it, you can't just put up a few bird boxes and hope for the best. Would you be wanting to see something quite different from perhaps the solar farms that we're used to seeing on the side of motorways at the minute?
So of the solar farms I went to, I didn't see any bird boxes. It was all hedgerows were the thing that kind of drove the increased number of birds, and no grazing. It was the grazing that kind of removed the long grass and seed heads that the birds were feeding on or looking for prey in. So if they're managed in a certain way, that's what will attract the species.
You could, though, manage an arable farm in that way. I'm sure organic farmers are probably shouting at the radio, pointing out that the way they manage their farms makes more space for nature.
That's a very good point. And yes, you can manage a farm in a certain way. But in this study, we only compared the intensive kind of managed solar farms with this solar farms managed with nature in mind and intensive arable. We didn't have a look at organic farms or regenerative farming practices where you are likely to see an increased number of birds than intensive arable farms.
We've been talking this week about the difficult nature of balancing land use to try and do all the very many things we want to do from it. Are you hopeful that what you're suggesting here actually suggests a compromise, at least on one part of the argument?
I think it does. I think what we need going forward is making use of multifunctional land uses, and this shows that you can provide clean energy whilst also benefiting biodiversity. And now's a good time to be talking about it with the launch of the England Land Use Framework consultation.
Joshua Copping from the RSPB there. That's it from us, but do get in touch about anything you hear, or indeed think you should hear on the programme. You can email us, we're farming.today@bbc.co.uk, or you could tweet us on X, where we are at BBC Farming Today. I'm Charlotte Smith, the producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.